This week I've got Judy, which is a biopic about Judy Garland, and once again it kind of continues this theme of music-related ones. It's not a musical like Rocket Man was. It's more along the lines of a Bohemian Rhapsody, and it stars Renee Zellweger as Judy Garland, and she's playing Judy Garland in her later years, in fact in her late 40s. This comment might be on the slightly more shallow side, but what Renee Zellweger has done to her own face has made it very challenging to watch, and she tries to pick up the mannerisms of Judy Garland. It actually reminds me more of a Liza Minnelli, which obviously Judy Garland is Liza Minnelli's mother, and so that makes sense in many senses. But, we've seen Liza Minnelli a lot more recently in the kind of more theatrical, also tick-riddled, T-I-C, not T-I-C-K, version of her, and there's a lot of just mouth movement from side to side and this, that, but it's hard to watch her face do it because it doesn't want to do it because she has had so much work done to her face. And it's mostly her face for a good 2 hours. So that was a particular challenge for me in watching this. I don't think, if you were not already a fan of Judy Garland, this movie's not going to make you a fan of Judy Garland. I don't think it's setting out to, but it's certainly trying to portray her as this sympathetic character. Just a little bit of backstory. Judy Garland started performing at age 2. She signed a contract with MGM back in the days of Hollywood, where you were a studio player, you lived and died and breathed by the studio you were with. There are a lot of flashbacks of her days getting ready for Wizard of Oz, and it sounded like it wasn't a particularly easy time. They were very basically abusive to her in terms of controlling when she should eat or what she couldn't eat, basically, and not letting her sleep and pumping her full of drugs so she would stay awake and work more. You feel sympathetic to that. The young version of her is played by Darcy Shaw, who's basically this freaked out, doe-eyed young woman, and it's a little much. This movie's just a little much. So you feel sympathetic to the character because of this past she's had, but then they completely gloss over how she kind of fell from grace and why she ends up going to London to do this tour to try and make back money because she's basically bankrupt, and not to judge that. That's not necessarily something I'm that makes her an unsympathetic character. No, shit happens to people. That being said, the way that they go about it does not make me feel like she's a particularly sympathetic character when you're she had a stardom that nobody will ever achieve that. Nobody's ever going to be Judy Garland. Nobody's ever going to be that person, that girl who was in The Wizard of Oz. Again, people, there are only so many movies coming out at the time. Everyone knew who she was. She was such a megastar. And so, it's kind of one of those what's the price of fame type things, but you didn't necessarily sign up for it. Anyway, but it's not about that part of it. It's again about these London stage performances that she gave. So Renee Zellweger also apparently does her own singing in this, and I thought she was not doing it because it is hard to watch her sing. It feels very dubbed, and I will acknowledge that in a lot of singing movies, unless you're actually singing live on set, it's going to lack a certain level of the way your body moves when you're singing. So that's not necessarily her fault. She could have done the actual music, but the way that they filmed it, and it's very close up, and sometimes it's just looking to camera, and there's just this hollow look in her eyes, and that is, I think, how I would describe this film as a whole. Hollow. It might have a glossy shell, but I felt it was hollow at the end of the day. I think the thing I found the most compelling out of this film is what Judy Garland stood for as a character and an icon. And this film, it goes into it. There's a subplot featuring it. But again, for those who don't know, you could say you were a friend of Dorothy, and that was a kind of LGBTQ code way of saying hey, I'm queer, but not getting in trouble for it. And so it was, I think Judy Garland certainly spoke to a certain era of closeted and not closeted necessarily, those brave souls who came out early, but I think she certainly spoke to a certain LGBTQ generation and was an icon for a reason, but she was more of a symbol. I don't know if she was super involved in that, and I don't know, and I don't know who could know at this point. Maybe Liza Minnelli might know. If Judy Garland knew she means that much to that community, or meant that much to that community. There's this whole subplot where she meets these two gay men who come to her London shows, and that to me, I think, was the sweetest, most emotionally powerful part of the shows, where those moments, that is the part of the movie that actually has subtlety. There's so much of her overacting, face tick, blah blah blah, singing on stage, she has a substance abuse problem and is an alcoholic basically. So oh, it's drunk Judy, oh, it's high Judy, oh, it's and this is just oh, it's quiet Judy. and it's these quiet men, and like just I found that to be the most powerful and compelling part of this film. But part of it was the fact that they found her so important, not like the character herself in that moment. I think the movie could have been about those two guys, and it might have been more compelling than this film as a whole. And you'd be like, oh, and then they get to go see Judy at the end, and like, that's it. And you'd be like, oh my God, I'm so happy for them. Like, that's the movie I probably would have wanted to see. This movie got super overhyped for me. They were like, oh, Renee Zellweger got like a 7-minute standing ovation at Toronto Film Festival. And I'm like, why? Why? Did we watch the same film? I think if you are someone who Judy Garland is or was a icon for and a symbol, as I previously described, like, you're going to enjoy this movie. I think if you were already a fan of Judy Garland, you know, if you're like a fan of old Hollywood and are familiar with a lot of this information, maybe you'll enjoy this movie. But I think if you are, you know, on the younger side or not super familiar, like, I don't think this is necessarily going to be endearing, or you're even going to particularly enjoy the journey she goes on, because she doesn't really go on a journey per se. Like, there's one moment towards the very end where I was like, oh, this is supposed to be the like, and there's a character arc, we swear. But it felt so rushed and a little, not out of place, but it's just like, oh, what snapped? Like, did suddenly she just in her brain, like this last moment, be like, oh, okay, cool. Now I'm going to be like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to grow as a character. I wish it had been in better paced is what I'm trying to say. So again, I think fan of Judy already, like, sure, go ahead and see this. You'll probably enjoy it. Not a fan, like, not interested. This doesn't sound appealing to you, or you were on the fence. Like, I'm actually going to suggest, you know, either skip it or go ahead and wait until it comes out on like DVD or home entertainment and that sort of thing. I personally am only going to give this 2.7 out of 5. I think the saving grace, again, is that storyline with the two gentlemen in London. But aside from that, like, I found it hollow. I found the musical performances, which there are a lot of in this film, like, hard to watch for the reasons I've described. You know, wasn't for me. I don't think it's going to be for as many people as they wanted it to be, and I think that's a problem. Like, I think you could have made this story possibly accessible. I think the framework's there. You know, I would have probably, like, written it in a different structure. I don't know if I'd have leaned as much on these flashbacks, or I'd have just been like, hey, this was her crappy childhood. This is why she's where she's at now, and, like, this is how she grows as a character. 3-story structure, 3-act structure, really. You know, pretty standard. Yeah, so 2.7 out of 5 for Judy for me.